All right, today I'm going to be talking about interpersonal communication. And in this topic, I'm going to be talking about what God intended for us to be as communicators on His earth and how we are supposed to communicate not only with ourselves, our neighbors, but also with God and what His intention was when He created such of the communication skills that we've gained throughout our life. Most of the points and subpoints that I'm going to point out and talk about is coming from the book An Essential Guide to Interpersonal Communication. This book is written by Quentin Schultze and Diane Badzinski. One of the first points that actually is kind of attributed in this book is just the fact about communicating love and what God intended for us to communicate, um, not communicate negatively to one another, but just to communicate love. I think a lot of this subject gets lost in between certain conversations that we have with people that may tend to turn ugly, as we talked about just a simple conversation with a customer service representative. When a customer service representative is contradicting what we're trying to point out, or trying to move the conversation forward, it's often easy for us to get angry and frustrated very quickly. Rather, God tells us to be patient and be slow to anger in such a situation. Psalm 37:30 says, "The mouth of the righteous utters wisdom, and his tongue speaks justice." And I think this is a great point that is in the Bible that just affirms this communicating love topic. When we think about communication, where we gain our communication, the book often talks about how we gain communication from the people around us and how we've grown up. Obviously, we have our teachers that have taught us actually direct communicating skills, but we also have our parents who we were visually able to watch as they communicated with others in different manners and different settings that made us kind of determine how we were also going to communicate as we grew into young adults and furthermore. The book also talks about gratitude and being grateful and such things as communicating love. This gratitude in any conversation that we have allows us to be more selfish, less selfish, and more servant oriented. So, saying in a simple conversation, how are we able to serve the person that we're talking to more by being more grateful? Being more grateful, the more grateful that we are, the more we are deeply in love, or have a deeper love for people, and even a deeper love for God, which is obviously what He called us to do. Having the right attitude is another attribute of communicating love. And the book talks about three basic attitudes that people generally convey when communicating with one another or as simply as themselves. One is the displeased communicators, and these are the communicators that often have a lot of criticism to give. They also have a lot of complaints. And you can kind of see this both externally, but often this also happens a lot internally. The second basic attitude that people convey is an indifferent communicators. These are the kind of people that kind of have the who cares or whatever kind of attitude. These are the people that typically don't work towards developing the relationships. Rather, they are more kind of complacent within the relationship that they are, whether that relationship is negative or positive. The third basic attitude, which is the attitude that God um, kind of more intended for us, and the kind of what is more of our theme in this slide, is the grateful communicators. These are the people that are more welcoming. They encourage one another, and they direct relationships towards affirmation by showing love through their communication. And that can be, as we might mention before or later on, verbally and nonverbal skills in that way. But not having a grateful attitude throughout all of this will diminish our meaning of a long-lasting relationship. So it's important to be thankful, have gratitude when we're communicating love in such ways. The next point is just listen carefully. This is obviously a huge part of communication. As we're listening to someone throughout a conversation or any kind of aspect of communication of those any kind. But obviously, we live in a world today that listening can be kind of difficult, and there's a barrier. We live in a world of technology where there's cell phones and text messages and emojis and those kind of things that don't necessarily show someone that you're typically listening, and then you don't show those verbal or nonverbal communications points that show someone or communicator that you actually are listening, you're paying attention, and that you care about a certain situation, whether it's a difficult situation. So it's very important for us to realize the world that we're living in and to be able to not pick up our phone during a conversation, because that might show the communicator that you're not 100% engaged in whatever they're trying to tell us. this, as the book kind of explains more and more about listening, they talk about empathy versus sympathy. Not that they're against each other in any way, but empathy means feeling with others, and sympathy means feeling for others. And I think God intended for both to be used in a certain manner, but He does call us not to be alone at all. And He's created this community among Earth, and we can even see this in just the church and how it's structured as a community oriented and worshiping together, not just by yourself. And therefore, feeling with others, you can be more relatable and you can relate to others very quickly, especially in that manner. So we grow in communication with God and others. That's something that God intended for us. But listening carefully to one another, this obviously forms intimate relationships. And this intimacy is the difference between something as a friendship and acquaintance. So intimate relationships is something that's going to last and be more forever, rather than if we're not listening or not paying attention to the ones we're talking about. That's where we learn to be more acquaintance, and we're not intentionally engaging in conversation and communication with those people. But we can see this in the Bible, where Jesus even names his followers as friends. And when we're talking about as friends and acquaintances. And even when we look at, I think the book mentions this, which I think is a great example, is that the Trinity is such a model of this friendship, where we see three perfect listeners who serve each other, and even others, obviously, as Christians and believers, such on an intimate level. And I think that's a really great mindset to keep in mind. James 1:19 says, "My dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry." And I think that's such a great point as we think about how listening affects the way that we can move towards being effective listeners and moving towards that shalom, as the book talks about. Another point that we want to look at is listening to ourselves, not just others. Both are equally important in our communicating lives. So self-identity is something that we have to look at, and self-identity often is shaped by our desires, and our desires shape how and why we communicate. So what am I going to gain by this relationship or this particular relationship, or what am I going to lose by this particular relationship? Something that we always think about consciously or subconsciously before we get inside or before we get into a relationship. Um, but watching our own identity is very important in order to be proficient as communicators and more dependent to those we interact with. So having that consistency of knowing who we are and how we're going to react in certain situations. Depending on how we react, there's a lot of different effects that the book talks about that we tentatively go towards, and cocooning effect is one of those effects that Schultz and Badzinski talks about. And the cocooning effect is when we identify forming it's a identifying forming pattern where we intentionally avoid people, either because we fear of relating with them or even if we intentionally want to make them feel bad. Often it's the other, where we're intentionally trying to avoid the situation because we don't relate with them. This is something that we often do because we don't want to have to deal with the situation. And so therefore we often create an identity forming these identity forming habits, that can be kind of negative and doesn't really move anybody forward in any sort of situation. But we see this effect even with the silent treatment. When you don't want to deal with a situation, you just shut yourself off, and therefore you don't have to deal with it, and you can remain silent. So what are our desires? How do we unify our self-identities and even social identities? So how do those things work together when we're in certain situations, especially social situations? So the book talks about three different things in this order. So we have to love God, love our neighbors, and love ourselves. And that's the point of this slide, is loving ourselves, as we desire to communicate on behalf of ourselves. So we love ourselves as neighbors too. So both in loving neighbors and loving ourselves are kind of coincide with one another, but both equally as important. When we think about loving ourselves, we also think about interpersonal communication and seeing how we communicate in situations. A Bible verse that I'd like to attribute to this slide is Psalms 4:4. Tremble, but do and tremble. Excuse me. Tremble and do not sin. Meditate in your heart upon your bed and be still. So meditate on your own heart and know how you're going to react. God also calls us to be an encourager, especially in communication. We all get discouraged through life, whether it's personal, financial reasons, um, marriage, work, school, any kind of situation can get us down and discouraged. And if we don't have anybody to bring us up, or if we don't have faith to rely on, often we can stay discouraged for a long time, and it can be self-conflicting, self-harming for us to stay in that way. I think what's really cool about the word encourage is that courage is in the word encourage. And so we must use our interpersonal communication skills to give others courage when they feel weak. We can see this in the Bible often as Jesus uses phrases such as do not be afraid or fear not. And he uses those phrases to give people courage to be able to stand up for themselves and to be able to feel the need to, or feel not the need to fear or be afraid. And this encouragement can come in all forms, both nonverbal and verbal, as we talked about. It can come in as simply as a hug, or also simply as someone writing a note to you and putting it on your desk to just encourage you through a tough time. And we can also see it as someone modeling encouragement through their daily lives, as we are able to see and visualize people going through their day. Ephesians 4:29 says, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." So being able to have that communication that actually builds people up rather than doing the opposite of bringing people down. In relationships, we often deal with conflict, and moving conflict forward towards forgiveness is very important. We're going to talk about harmony in the next slide, but just to mention some of that here is really important as we talk about forgiveness. So how do we work towards restoring relationship? It's very important to restore relationship rather than simply give up on them. I think God calls us very clearly to do so. Matthew 6:14-15 says, "If you forgive others the wrongs they have done for you, your Father in heaven will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, then your Father will not forgive you the wrongs you have done." And I think this is really important as we think about all of the things as we read the Bible through Romans and throughout the Bible as we talk about our sin and our natural fall of man and how God was able to forgive us through his own Son. I think that's really important. But I also think that's really cool that the Bible uses God's merciful saints as an example of being merciful to those around us and in our communication skills. I think that's really important to do so. Lastly, I want to talk about harmony and promoting peace within conflicts. This is something that God really intends us to do when it comes to big conflicts within our lives. Instead of running away from them, promoting the peace within them. This is something that Jesus did on and on throughout the Bible, and it's something that he's called us to do as he calls us to be like him. All relationships have conflict. It can be both positive and a negative thing. One of the myths is that all conflict is negative, but that's not necessarily true. Conflict can move us forward and move towards resolution. All conflict must lead somewhere, and promoting peace obviously moves conflict closer to that shalom or that peace. So what does shalom look like? Shalom is the more of the biblical life that God intended, full of community and hope rather than negative conflict. Shalom is God's intention for our living, and when the wholeness of our shalom is complete, we joyfully live with God and our neighbors and ourselves. Like I said before, loving God, loving our neighbors, and loving ourselves, very important things throughout communication and throughout our personal lives. So human flourishing, how do we do this? So peace and justice come from unified as a new heaven and a new earth. Following Jesus is simply a call to be peacemakers. As we listen, speak, and encourage, discern what it means to communicate with the kind of peace that Jesus intended us for. And I just kind of wanted to leave with this last verse, Romans 12:16-21. It says, "Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty. Be associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. If possible, so far as it depends on you, live peacefully with it all. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord.' To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." I think this is a great verse to end with as we talk about just living a harmonious life and moving towards shalom and being able to communicate effectively with others in our relationships.